Welcome to the Wade Center Podcast,
a podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome back to the Wade Center Podcast. I'm Jim Beitler, director of the Marion E. Wade Center, and we are back. I'm here with Aaron Hill, and again with John Walton. We wanted to have more of a conversation with you. We had so much fun last time that we thought it would be fun to talk with you in a little bit more detail about a specific topic related to the origins debates, and that is the topic of evolution.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about this, Dr. Walton, because as Jim and I have talked before on the podcast, and I talk with the Downings, I feel like people tend to read Lewis, and they read their own views on creation and evolution into Lewis, and so there's a lot of books out there that are interpreting sort of Lewis's perspective on these things, and they almost always tend to look exactly like whatever that person happens to believe. And so I wanted to get you to weigh in on, what do you think Lewis's views on evolution are, and how does that maybe line up with maybe some of the modern discussions that are occurring in the church?
I first read Lewis when I was in high school and talking about the 60s and the 70s. And as I've worked through the issues of modern science, especially evolution, and trying to understand the Bible, Lewis's perspectives were very important ones for me to try to make careful distinctions. And I think that one of the most important distinctions that he makes is the distinction between biological evolution and social evolution. And of course, he talks about that most in his essays. There's one in The Weight of Glory. There's one in Christian Reflections, especially The Funeral of the Great Myth. But he also has a fascinating expression of this concept of social evolution that he puts in the mouth of Weston in Perelandra.
Oh, okay.
He says, the majestic spectacle of this blind, inarticulate purposiveness thrusting its way upward and ever upward in an endless unity of differentiated achievements toward an ever-increasing complexity of organization, toward spontaneity and spirituality. That's in the words of Weston, and of course, Ransom will have nothing to do with it. So that's how Lewis reflects on this concept that he rejects about evolution. He rejects that idea that evolution is about improvement. He very much embraces the idea that biological evolution is absolutely acceptable, but it's a matter of change. And that's a distinction he draws in Funeral of the Great Myth.
Okay, so the idea is things are changing, but there's no guarantee that they're going to get better, that they're moving towards some goal, that there's an agent behind it. I think one of the discussions you hear a lot when people talk about evolution, at least from a scientific perspective, is they really drive home like random, and you see that in that line, blind, inarticulate purpose,
right.
Persistiveness, the idea that there's not really any sort of agent behind it. So how does Lewis kind of reconcile that, accepting biological evolution but rejecting social evolution?
Well, again, it's the agency that's important. Evolution as a social theory is just the ever upward development of humanity. But even in biological evolution, Lewis would not accept the idea that was without agency. And so in that sense, he would reflect, I think, what is a view growing in popularity today, that even if we adopt an evolutionary model, we still would see God as the agent behind it all.
So you mentioned the Funeral of the Great Myth. Was there anything from that essay that kind of stands out that helps you make sense of where Lewis stands? What does he mean by the Great Myth?
Yeah. Well, again, the Great Myth is the social evolution idea.
Gotcha.
And so it's the funeral of it because he's debunking that.
Okay.
But again, he wants to make it clear that as he debunks social evolution, he's not therefore rejecting biological evolution. So he talks about the idea that scientific evolution, and that's the biological evolution, makes no cosmic statements, no metaphysical statements, no eschatological statements. And again, for all of those, he brings the agent in. God is the agent of creation, just as Aslan sings and the world unfolds.
How do you read, this is another question I've always wanted to ask you, how do you read there's these like sea creatures in Perelandra? Ransom is riding this dolphin. He's chasing the unmanned towards the end of the story. They've had this big battle, and he looks down and he sees these like human-like sea creatures that almost have human faces, but they're almost like mermaids or something.
Yeah,
and he eats some of the weeds, and he starts to have this dream like he's under the water himself, and it's almost like a sort of a pre-human form, almost like a Neanderthal or these sort of pre-Homo sapien creatures. Mm-hmm. What's your interpretation? What's your reading of what Lewis is doing there?
I didn't read it that way.
Okay.
I mean, clearly there were other, at least vaguely humanoid creatures around, but that's certainly, I wouldn't see that as fueling some idea that Lewis thought of a whole Neanderthal population or something and some chosen out from among them, which of course is a view that some people have today. It's not mine, but that's how people sometimes think. So I guess I didn't see enough there to really latch on to.
So you would see it as just sort of like another kind of creature, like they're fawns in Narnia, but there's not necessarily a common ancestor with fawns or something.
Right.
Okay, all right.
Likewise, the nymphs and...
Yeah.
Moving away from Lewis for a second, what about your own reading of Genesis and the whole Lost World series? How do you see evolution interfacing with the Genesis narrative or your own work?
Sure. Well, of course, I, not being any kind of trained scientist, actually having no aptitude in science whatsoever, I'm not in a position to evaluate the science. But I think it's a very important question to ask: is the biblical account compatible with that particular model, as we know it, as scientists paint it? Is the biblical text compatible with it? People who see incompatibility would first of all say, well, no, because Genesis has an agent of creation. It's got God in it, and evolution doesn't. And it's true that evolutionary theory doesn't have God in it because evolutionary theory is a science. It can't talk about an agent. It can't address the question of an agent. So that's not a contradictory claim. It's just it can't address it. It can address mechanisms. It can't address agency. That's science. So that objection is not one. Certainly there are evolutionary scientists who are atheists, but that doesn't mean that evolutionary models are inherently atheistic. Again, if you want to plug in an agent somewhere, you can do it into an evolutionary model just as easily. The other place where they would say that there's incompatibility are things like the long ages and the existence of death before the fall. Those things are necessary for evolutionary models. And so there the question is the Bible claiming those things? We have to evaluate if the Bible is making those claims. If it is, then there could be some inherent incompatibility. If the Bible requires a young earth, if the Bible requires no death before the fall, then there would be some incompatibility. But as I've evaluated those questions, it doesn't look to me like the Bible is making affirmations in either of those.
Gotcha.
In which case, there's no reason to think that the biblical account is not compatible. Finally, the point I would raise is that we have generally, throughout history, thought about the biblical account as a material account. And therefore, as a material account, we would try to deduce certain aspects of science from it. Because science is our way of talking about materiality and physicality. I've presented the idea that no, the biblical account is more about order bringing instead of object making. And if it's not about object making, and that's what evolution is, kind of talking about material development, well, then it's not really talking about the same thing. And therefore, again, it's not incompatible. That doesn't mean evolution's right, but if the Bible's compatible with it, then it's an option for us to think that way. If we're willing to think about agency instead of mechanism, if we're willing to think about focus on order instead of material, then those things are not irresolvable. And so that's the way I tend to think about it.
Well, one of the things that really interests me about your story and your journey is that you were raised in a church where young earth creationism was kind of widely believed.
Kind of the default, yeah.
The default. And I'm interested in stories about people changing their mind.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about what led to the change for you in these views?
Sure. So I've got a little plaque in my office that says, "Lord, give me this day my daily opinion and forgive me the one I had yesterday." I think it's an important academic exercise to change your mind, to be ready to change your mind. And so I've tried to cultivate that, nurture that, a willingness to hold my views lightly and be willing to change. And the understanding that I just reflected about agency versus mechanism, about compatibility, instead of proving this thing true or not, the change from material to order, all of those kind of came one at a time and were pieces that kind of fell into place to help put it together. So I had years when I thought that they were not compatible in my early life. Then many of the conversations of my early adulthood, I was just trying to figure it out. My wife was a trained biochemist, and therefore we had this conversation a lot.
Oh, wow.
Science and Bible. And likewise, she was very open-minded about. We were both together trying to figure it all out from our various perspectives. And then just gradually pieces came more and more together. To come up with something that I think makes some sense, both of the biblical narrative and about trying to think about our scientific understanding. You know, if tomorrow the headlines blasted, "Evolution proven false, we were wrong all along," it wouldn't change what I do with Genesis. You know, I mean, if evolutionary models weren't there, another model based on mechanisms would take its place. And if it's based on mechanisms, well, it's not in contradiction to the Bible, because the Bible's not about mechanisms. It's about agency. And so that distinction was an important one for me, agency and mechanism.
Can you talk a little bit about your most recent book? We have a second to...
This is New Explorations in the Lost World of Genesis, Advances in the Origins Debate. Just came out in April.
Yes. So Lost World of Genesis 1 was written 15 years ago. Since then, I've been on the road a lot, have given hundreds and hundreds of presentations about
This isn't the first one?
No. I'm making all this up on the fly. And regularly field questions. And I hear the questions people ask, the concerns that they have. I try to figure out how to answer them well. Sometimes I hit on new terminology. Sometimes I come up with a new illustration, like the one I used about the play in the last time I was talking with you. And so I've learned how to express things better. I've learned some new perspectives, new vantage points. I've gained from some new insights in conversation with other people. I've read the critical reviews and tried to figure out what questions are being asked. How can I clarify this? So I've had 15 years to polish this thing.
Gotcha.
And so that's really what this new book represents. It's not a revised edition. It's saying, okay, how has the thinking advanced in the last 15 years? What are some new insights? What are some new theories? What's some new evidence? What are some new illustrations? What's some new terminology? And so in each of the categories I deal with there, of course, Genesis 1 and the Garden of Eden and the Adam and Eve and all of those things, all those categories, including science and faith, I deal with what are kind of some of the new things that are contributing to my thinking and to my presentations. But then probably half the book is made up of scattered over 60 FAQs, the questions people typically ask, because that way I can focus my comments to say, here's a question people have, and here's how I would answer it. So that's really what's in the book.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Check out that book.
Definitely.
It's a great resource that expands beyond what Dr. Walton has previously written on the topic. I have one more question for you about this. I imagine that there are a lot of people who disagree with you, and sometimes those disagreements can maybe get heated. I would imagine around evolution in particular. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with that? How do you address that? How do you respond to that? Do you have any advice? I'm just thinking that we live in such a polarized climate right now in terms of argument with people in their own filter bubbles. How do you speak into that and have conversation across difference and disagreement?
So first of all, I often address mixed audiences, and I mean mixed audiences within a Christian context.
Okay.
Sometimes I address audiences that are non-Christian, but mostly in Christian contexts. But I know there are people out there who think all kinds of different ways. So one of the first things I say is, my job here is not to convince you to think the way I do. My job is not to create a room full of clones. My job is to put information on the table and ideas on the table that you may have never heard before. And I just put them there for you to consider. Yeah. And if you walk out thinking the same thing you did when you went in and it's different from me, that's fine. We all have to try to make sense of it as best we can, but I've got information that you might not have, and I'd love you to consider it with an open mind. The second thing I do is that whenever I start these conversations, I start with biblical authority. People really need to hear that that's where I'm coming from, not just as sort of token language, but rather this really is my heart, the authority of text, and I feel like I am honoring and being accountable to that authority. Now, they might not agree with me, and that's fine. But they need to hear that from me. If that gets me just an iota of trust, I'll take it. Yeah. So that's a second strategy. A third strategy is I don't debate. If you feel different than me and you want to argue, don't. I won't. I'm not here to argue with anybody. I'm not trying to prove I'm right or prove you're wrong, and I don't want you to be doing that to me either. We have our opinions and the reasons why we've developed them. And so I've been invited enough times to be involved in debates, and I always turn it down because I'm not about trying to prove somebody else wrong or to take shots at them to show that they're idiots. So I don't mind contexts where a couple different people are there to convey different positions.
Gotcha.
But I avoid places where it's set up for debate and to try to find out who wins. So those are just some of my tactics when people, very occasionally in Q&A sessions, get a little exercised.
Yeah.
I always try to diffuse the situation, and it almost always is possible. Again, diffusing it doesn't mean changing their mind, nor does it mean overwhelming them with my scholarship or something. I'm not there to take them out at the knees. I want to hear their concerns. I want to hear what they have to say. Yeah. So I want to come across as still a work in process instead of this is how it's got to be.
Yeah.
I want to come across as a gracious conversation partner instead of somebody who's shouting down the opposition. Yeah. So it's just those kinds of things.
Yeah. That's very wise. Thank you for that perspective. And thanks for joining us for 2 parts of the Wade Center podcast.
Yeah.
It's been a fun conversation.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, past collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.